Hello YouTube, I'm Tom, and today we are turning yogurt pots into vents with control terminals. This build came about mainly by accident. While washing up these yogurt pots, I'd noticed they were actually quite decent, thick, good quality plastic. It's a rare thing these days. Obviously, it's better for the environment to reduce the quality of plastic used, but it has made hobby recycling more challenging. While I decided what to do with them, I sat down at my desk and started measuring the pot's dimensions. At my desk, I'd also been measuring up some Zone Mortalis tiles for a different project, and noticed, with a little delight it has to be said, that the pots fitted almost exactly over the vents. It was fate then. That's what I was doing with them. I removed the tabs with scissors and got down to sanding the plastic. I used wetted sanding sponge and really annoyed my wife who was trying to watch TV with an almost solid half an hour of sanding noise. The sanding helps the paint adhere and remove the majority of the paper still stuck to the adhesive. Next, I fired up Adobe Illustrator and designed all the additional elements I needed. A base for the pots to lock nicely into the Zone Mortalis tiles, the extended top vents, and a control terminal. These were all then cut from 1mm PVC foam board on my Cricut Explore 3. The pieces were removed and where necessary given a little cleanup with a sharp scalpel. I always make sure to keep the offcuts and the sheet I've cut from, to use later for other bits and bobs. Foamex is so easy to cut by hand, I've reused the majority of all the sheets I've cut. I began dry fitting the parts for the consoles and immediately discovered a small error. These happen sometimes when I'm rushing or working on something relatively low risk like this project. All I'd done was slightly overextend the bottom of the screen holder, and by eye I simply sliced off around 2mm from each piece and they fitted perfectly. I assembled the consoles using thin superglue, applied from a blob with a little offcut of wire. In addition to the PVC foam board, I added a 2mm nail art bead. The consoles went together as planned, and I was really pleased with them. Next, I glued together the vents for the tops of the pots, once again using superglue. I then checked the fit of the bases on the Zone Mortalis boards, and the clunk, as the base fitted perfectly where I wanted it, was very satisfying indeed. I had a bit of a dilemma with the consoles. I hadn't really decided if I wanted them glued to the pots as is, or with a backing. The backing was tricky, as it would need to conform to the curve of the pot. I noticed that the gap behind the consoles looked about 5mm, and so I shoved a rogue bit of XPS underfloor heating foam in there, and discovered it was the perfect depth. The bonus of the foam was that I could deform it to fit nicely around the curve of the pot. I cut down a long chunk of foam, slid it into each of the gaps and then cut away the excess. I used a superglue cap that I had at hand and compressed the foam into a gentle concave curve and then glued them into the backs of the consoles. Next up, I needed to decide the height the consoles would sit. I grabbed the nearest mini. This guy is a medley of bits made on my daughter's instructions, with her choosing and clipping away the parts and me doing the gluing. I placed the mini and kept the height in mind. I then glued the consoles, the vent, and the base to the pot, before adding more nail art beads for detail. I then needed to address the sides of the pots. Again, I hadn't much of an idea other than add some detail, but I remembered a trick for a wiring conduit I'd used elsewhere. This is thin styrene rod, and as long as you're careful it can be bent without snapping. I would run this to a box of some kind and could vary the layout across the different builds. I glued down the wiring box, made from foam, and added some very simple detail. I then checked the fit of the wire and carefully adjusted it as necessary before gluing it into place. I thought this looked decent, but it did need something else. I decided to come back to it later, perhaps using some epoxy putty to make cable clips. In the meantime, I added various panels around the pots using offcuts of mainly 0.25mm styrene. Its flexibility made it perfect for conforming to the curve of the pots. While I was detailing the panels, I came up with a solution to the wire cable clips. I took an old plastic cotton wool bud tube, cut 3mm-ish lengths, then split them in two down the centre. These C-shaped pieces fitted almost perfectly over the styrene rod and made awesome clips. I got a bunch cut down and glued them over the conduit with superglue. And here we have the 4 vents. They're all similar, but also individual. The last step before painting was adding a little texture. I've been really enjoying applying some carefully selected areas of rust using PVA and baking powder. Next, all the pots got 2 coats of white gesso primer. This was painted, then stippled to add texture and disguise the paint strokes. Thankfully, the sanding had done its job and the paint adhered really well to the plastic. Choosing what colour to paint the vents did give me a bit of a headache. I had really bad indecision, going back and forth between a few choices. In the end, I settled on a desaturated red, for no other reason than I had to pick something. I was drawn to the red, but knew that weathering would struggle, as the browns, oranges and yellows of dirt and rust can get a bit lost. The first coat of red covered well, but looked a little too patchy, so I gave the pots a second coat, then moved on to painting the dark black brown as a base for the metallics. After this, I painted the console body a mid-grey, before creating a simple gradient from dark to light on the monitor. This monochrome gradient would serve as the base for the slight glow of the monitor, and will come alive later with a green wash. I then painted on the metallics. In hindsight, I think I went a little dark, underestimating how much the weathering would knock them back. I think, unless you want really dark metallics, start with a very light metallic, as it's much easier to weather more than repaint bits brighter. Next, I went over all the areas I wanted to be white or wanted to be a solid colour. I much prefer one coat of colour over white to multiple coats over overspills of strong colours like red and black, even if it does feel like a bit of a faff. These sections were then selectively painted with quite primary colours. These would contrast nicely with the desaturated red and get knocked back by the weathering to be more subtle later. I then moved on to detailing. Starting with the monitors, I used almost pure white to very carefully sketch in some dots and lines to represent information on the screens. I then added various signs and markings to emphasise the industrial nature of the vents, help to add scale and break up the large areas of flat red. For the weathering, I knew my normal strategies would struggle on their own, so I decided on a slightly more labour-intensive approach, but one I thought would look really good. Using a sponge, I stippled in largish patches of a pinkish white, before merging some of the smaller clumps with some brush painting. This looks a bit odd initially, as it's too much coverage, but it's necessary to go a bit over the top to help with the next stage. With that layer dry, we come in with a black brown and work our darker chips into the bigger areas of pinkish white. This has the appearance of chipping down through 2 layers of paint, but really we've done it to outline the dark chips so they aren't lost against the red. This looks quite painfully slow, but once you're in the rhythm, it's really low effort and goes quite quickly. Although, you do need a brush with a decent tip. When I moved on to the oil weathering, I couldn't decide if I'd do targeted recess washes or the reductive method. In the end, I channeled my inner Necromundan and went with the most filthy option, slapping the thick brown wash all over. After leaving the oils to begin curing for around an hour, I came in with a cloth, dampened with mineral spirits. Last time I used this method I used kitchen paper, with almost disastrous results, and I was positive the cloth would be a better move. It was definitely an improvement, but some finessing with a brush was necessary. It did shed a few fibres, but nothing terrible. I'm still not sure it's a method I'm really into, but you can't argue with the grimy results you get from it. After this, I made the mistake of leaving the pots to dry in a cooler area of the room. This coincided with some cold weather, and when I came back to do the next layer of oils, the last layer had barely dried. I moved the pots next to the radiator and waited. Around a week later and still not 100% dry, I moved on to the rust. For this, I usually use a mix of orange and yellow ochre. I knew the orange would be a waste of time, so wanted to try a little dust in the form of a light grey wash. This ended up being a bit of a waste of time too, as I didn't go heavy enough with it to really make a difference, as I was worried about it looking more like unpainted areas than dust. The yellow ochre was mixed into a thick wash and stippled into the chips, with more being applied to the larger areas of rust. Once again, I let the oil begin to cure for around an hour before using a brush, dampened with mineral spirits, to drag over the rust spots to create streaks. It takes a bit of practice, but I really enjoy varying the amount of pressure and the spirits on the brush to add variety to the types of streaks created. I especially enjoy making the streaks cover areas of iconography and signage to better age and blend them into the piece. The last step was finishing the monitors. I made a wash of transparent green and yellow. This works fine with thinned opaque paint, but I have the transparents and they do give a superior effect. You can see the oils, even once fully dry, have created a hydrophobic layer, and initially the wash has trouble sticking. I use a light scrubbing action and ensure the top surface is fully covered, and eventually the paint adheres just fine. I also daubed a little of the wash roughly around the monitor to show a little cast light. I ended up adding a second wash of the same mix to intensify the green a little more. It's always good to build up slowly with this process, as there isn't really any going back if you go too heavy in the first place. The final element was adding a gloss varnish over the monitors in several coats. This intensifies the depth of the green and creates contrast against the dull, less reflective surfaces of the rest of the vents, which makes the consoles a nice focal part. I think they came out really well, even if I didn't really disguise the yogurt potness of them enough. My other criticism, that I only noticed at the end, is that by choosing a terracotta red, they do slightly take on the appearance of inverted plant pots. That said, in context, it's not something that bugs me. I'm most happy with the consoles and their wiring. I really like features on scenery and terrain that not only creates good details, but also allow it to be functional in game if you desire. It should always be a case of, what is this thing and how does it work? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Are they still too yogurty? Just upside down plant pots? What would you change? Anyway, I'll catch you next time. See you, YouTube!